Marcus Thompson had always been the type of person who thought rules were more like suggestions. The 42-year-old real estate agent from Denver had made his fortune by pushing boundaries and testing limits, so when he arrived in London for his first European vacation, he brought that same attitude with him. His wife Sarah had warned him before they left that British culture was different, more formal, but Marcus just laughed it off. How different could it really be? The couple had spent their first 3 days hitting all the tourist spots. They rode. The London Eye visited the Tower of London and took countless photos in front of Big Ben. But Marcus found himself increasingly frustrated by what he saw as unnecessary formality everywhere they went. The museum guards who politely but firmly redirected crowds, the restaurant servers who maintained professional distance, and especially the stone-faced royal guards who stood motionless at their posts. It was Sarah who first suggested they visit Buckingham Palace. She had read about the changing of the guard ceremony in their guidebook and thought it would be romantic to watch together. Marcus agreed, though his reasons were entirely different. He had seen videos online of tourists trying to make the guards break character, and he was convinced he could do better than any of them. The morning of their palace visit dawned gray and drizzly, typical London weather that matched Marcus's growing impatience with the city's restraint. As they walked through St. James's Park toward the palace, Marcus kept pointing out what he called the stuffiness of everything around them. The perfectly manicured gardens, the orderly queues of tourists, even the way people walked seemed too controlled for his liking. Sarah, meanwhile, was enchanted by the history surrounding them. She stopped frequently to read plaques and take photos, her enthusiasm growing with each step closer to the palace. She had researched the guards extensively and shared facts about their training, their uniforms, and the centuries-old traditions they upheld. Marcus nodded along, but his mind was elsewhere, already plotting his approach to getting a reaction from one of these famously impassive sentries. When they finally arrived at the palace gates, Marcus was struck by the grandeur of the building despite himself. The ornate ironwork, the massive stone facade, and the sense of history were undeniably impressive. But what caught his attention most were the two guards standing at their posts, rifles at their sides, tall black bearskin hats perfectly positioned, eyes staring straight ahead with unwavering focus. The morning crowd was typical for a weekday in October, mostly older tourists and a few school groups being shepherded by patient teachers. Marcus watched as various people attempted to get the guards' attention. A group of teenagers made faces and waved their arms. An elderly man from Germany tried speaking to one guard in broken English. A young woman from Australia attempted to pose for a selfie directly in front of a guard, only to be politely moved along by palace security. Each failed attempt only reinforced Marcus's belief that he could succeed where others had failed. He studied the guards more carefully, noting their breathing patterns, the slight shifts in their stance, any tiny crack in their professional demeanor that he could exploit. What he needed, he decided, was something unexpected, something that would catch them completely off guard. That's when he noticed Mrs. Henderson walking her dog nearby. The elderly British woman was a regular in the area, taking her morning constitutional with Wellington, her energetic Jack Russell Terrier. Wellington was everything a proper British. Dogs should be well-trained, well-groomed, and usually well-behaved. But like many small dogs, he had a big personality and occasionally acted out when he felt ignored or understimulated. Marcus watched the interaction between Mrs. Henderson and her pet with growing interest. The dog was clearly intelligent and responsive to commands, but also had a mischievous streak that reminded Marcus of himself. When Wellington briefly slipped his leash to chase a pigeon, Marcus saw opportunity knocking. He approached Mrs. Henderson with his most charming smile, the same one that had closed hundreds of real estate deals back in Denver. He complimented her on her beautiful dog and struck up what seemed like casual conversation about pet ownership. Mrs. Henderson, pleased to meet a friendly American tourist, was happy to chat about Wellington's breed, his training, and his various quirks and personality traits. What Mrs. Henderson didn't realize was that Marcus was conducting reconnaissance. He was learning about Wellington's commands, his triggers, his favorite treats, and most importantly, his weaknesses. The dog was food-motivated, attention-seeking, and had a particular fondness for playing tug-of-war with any rope-like object he could find. As their conversation continued, Marcus's plan began to take shape. He would somehow involve Wellington in his attempt to break the guard's composure. A dog would be unexpected, animals were naturally unpredictable, and surely even the most disciplined guard would have to react if a dog created enough of a disturbance. Sarah, who had been admiring the palace architecture, rejoined the conversation and immediately took to Wellington. She had grown up with dogs and had a natural way with animals that made Wellington warm to her instantly. This gave Marcus even more confidence in his developing scheme. If Sarah could help him gain Wellington's trust and cooperation, his plan would be that much more likely to succeed. Mrs. Henderson eventually excused herself, mentioning that she needed to complete her morning routine before the weather worsened. She wished the American couple a pleasant stay in London and headed off with Wellington, trotting obediently beside her. But Marcus wasn't ready to let this opportunity walk away. He spent the next 20 minutes observing the guards' routines, more carefully, timing their movements, noting when they seemed most alert and when they appeared to be settling into the monotony of their duty. He also kept one eye on Mrs. Henderson's route, noting that she followed a predictable path through the park that would bring her back past the palace gates in approximately 30 minutes. Sarah began to sense that her husband was planning something. Though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it might be, she knew that look in his eyes. The same expression he got when he was about to make a particularly aggressive offer on a property, or when he was preparing to negotiate a difficult deal. It usually meant he was about to do something that pushed boundaries, and in this formal, tradition-bound setting that made her nervous. The stage was set for what Marcus believed would be his moment of triumph, though he had no idea just how spectacularly wrong things were about to go. The opportunity Marcus had been waiting for presented itself sooner than expected. Mrs. Henderson appeared to be having a conversation with another dog walker near the Victoria Memorial, and Wellington was becoming increasingly restless as the two elderly women chatted. The little Jack Russell kept pulling at his leash, clearly wanting to continue his walk and explore more of the interesting scents around the palace grounds. Marcus nudged Sarah and pointed toward the scene. "Look, that dog's getting antsy. This might be perfect timing." Sarah followed his gaze but still wasn't sure what her husband had in mind. She had learned over their 15 years of marriage that Marcus's schemes usually involved some form of showmanship. But this felt different somehow. The formal atmosphere around the palace seemed to demand respect, not pranks. As they watched, Wellington managed to slip his collar again. Mrs. Henderson was so engrossed in her conversation about the upcoming flower show that she didn't notice immediately. The small dog trotted away from the two women, his nose to the ground, following some fascinating trail that led him directly toward the palace gates where Marcus and Sarah were standing. This was the moment Marcus had been hoping for, though he hadn't expected it to happen quite so naturally. Wellington approached them with the friendly confidence typical of his breed, tail wagging and clearly hoping for attention or perhaps a treat. Marcus crouched down and let the dog sniff his hand, remembering everything Mrs. Henderson had told him about Wellington's personality and preferences. Sarah watched nervously as her husband began engaging with the loose dog. She could see Mrs. Henderson in the distance, now frantically looking around for her missing pet, but she was too far away to intervene immediately. The situation was developing quickly, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that they were about to become unwitting participants in something that could go very wrong. Marcus, however, was feeling increasingly confident. Wellington was responding well to him, and the dog's natural curiosity was leading him closer to the guard's post. The timing seemed perfect. There were plenty of tourists around to witness whatever was about to happen, but not so many that security would be immediately overwhelming. The guards themselves seemed to be in their typical state of focused alertness, staring straight ahead and apparently oblivious to the small drama unfolding just meters away. What Marcus didn't understand, and what would prove to be his crucial miscalculation, was the extensive training that the Queen's guards underwent. These weren't just ceremonial figures in fancy uniforms. They were active duty soldiers from elite regiments, trained to handle everything from terrorist threats to crowd control. They were taught to assess situations quickly and respond appropriately to any potential disturbance, no matter how seemingly innocent. The guard closest to where Wellington was wandering was Guardsman James Morrison, a 24-year-old from Scotland who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for ceremonial duties. Morrison had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain motionless, while simultaneously tracking everything happening around him through his peripheral vision. He had already noted the loose dog, the concerned elderly woman in the distance, and the American couple who seemed unusually interested in the developing situation. Marcus decided to test the waters. He began making clicking sounds to get Wellington's attention, hoping to encourage the dog to move even closer to the guard post. Wellington, always eager to please and attracted by the interesting sounds, began trotting in that direction. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, whispering urgently that they should probably help return the dog to its owner instead of encouraging it to wander. But Marcus was too caught up in the excitement of his plan to listen to reason. He could see exactly how this would play out. The dog would approach the guard, maybe brush against his leg or bark for attention. The guard would have to break character to deal with the situation, and Marcus would capture it all on his phone to share with friends back home. It would be the perfect story about how he had succeeded where so many other tourists had failed. What actually happened next would become the stuff of legend among the palace security team, though not in the way Marcus had hoped. Wellington, following the encouraging sounds Marcus was making, did indeed approach Guardsman Morrison's position. But instead of simply brushing against the guard or barking for attention, the energetic terrier spotted something that triggered his strongest natural instinct. Hanging from Morrison's ceremonial uniform was a decorative cord, part of the traditional dress that marked his rank and regiment. To Wellington's canine eyes, this wasn't a piece of military history dating back centuries. It was the most appealing rope toy he had ever seen, dangling tantalizingly at just the right height for a dog of his size to grab. Morrison felt the slight tug on his uniform immediately. His training kicked in automatically, but he was facing a situation that hadn't been covered in any manual. The protocols for dealing with human troublemakers were clear and well rehearsed. The procedures for handling genuine security threats were second nature. But nowhere in his extensive training had anyone prepared him for what to do when a small dog decided to turn part of his ceremonial uniform into a game of tug-of-war. Wellington had latched onto the cord with the determination that only a terrier can display. His entire body was engaged in the effort, back legs braced, head shaking vigorously as he attempted to claim his prize. The cord was securely attached to Morrison's uniform, so rather than coming free, it was creating an increasingly vigorous pulling match between dog and soldier. Marcus began reaching for his phone, delighted that his plan was working even better than he had hoped. This was going to be the video that made him internet famous. He could already imagine the likes and shares as people watched a tiny dog successfully disrupting the legendary composure of a Queen's Guard. But Guardsman Morrison was facing a genuine dilemma. His orders were to remain motionless and maintain his post unless facing a legitimate security threat. A small dog playing with his uniform didn't qualify as such a threat, but it was creating a situation that was rapidly becoming undignified for both himself and the institution he represented. He could feel the cord pulling more insistently as Wellington became more excited by the resistance. The other tourists were beginning to notice the commotion. Phones were coming out and a small crowd was gathering. Morrison could hear the murmurs of amusement and anticipation from the growing audience. This was exactly the kind of situation that the guards were trained to avoid, a spectacle that turned their solemn duty into entertainment for visitors. Sarah was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. She could see Mrs. Henderson approaching at a rapid pace, looking embarrassed and concerned. The elderly woman was calling Wellington's name and apologizing profusely to anyone within earshot. But Wellington was far too engrossed in his tug-of-war game to pay attention to anything else. Marcus, however, was practically glowing with satisfaction. Everything was going exactly as he had hoped and even better than he had dared to expect. The guard was clearly struggling with how to handle the situation, and the growing crowd of amused onlookers was proof that Marcus had succeeded in creating the kind of memorable moment that would give him bragging rights for years to come. What none of them realized was that the situation was about to escalate in ways that no one could have predicted, and that Marcus's moment of triumph was about to turn into something entirely different. The moment everything changed began with what seemed like a simple stumble. Wellington, in his enthusiasm to claim the decorative cord, had been pulling with increasing vigor while backing up to get better leverage. His small paws scrambled for purchase on the smooth pavement, and in his excitement, He miscalculated his footing on the wet surface left by the morning's drizzle. When Wellington slipped, several things happened simultaneously. The sudden release of tension on the cord sent Guardsman Morrison swaying slightly forward, just enough to break his perfectly maintained stance. Wellington, now off balance, let out a sharp yelp of surprise that pierced the quiet morning air around the palace. And Marcus, who had been so focused on filming what he thought was his moment of triumph, failed to notice the small but significant crowd that had gathered behind him. The yelp was what triggered the first real complication. Palace security protocols included specific procedures for animal distress calls, developed after incidents involving everything from aggressive birds to escaped zoo animals in nearby parks. The sound of an animal in apparent distress near the palace gates automatically elevated the security alert level, not because of any direct threat, but because such situations could create dangerous crowd dynamics. Detective Sergeant Patricia Williams of the Metropolitan Police, who had been conducting a routine patrol of the palace perimeter, heard Wellington's yelp and immediately began moving toward the source. Williams had 15 years of experience in crowd control and had seen how quickly innocent situations could spiral out of control when tourists gathered and started taking photos or videos. Meanwhile, Marcus was becoming increasingly animated as he filmed. He began calling out encouragement to Wellington, apparently thinking he could direct the dog's actions like a scene from a movie. "Come on, boy. Get that rope. Show him who's boss." His voice carried clearly across the plaza, and his obvious delight in the situation was becoming apparent to everyone around him. Sarah tugged at her husband's sleeve more urgently. "Marcus, people are staring. I think we should help get the dog back to its owner." But Marcus waved her off, too caught up in what he saw as his moment of glory to pay attention to the warning signs that were becoming obvious to everyone else. Mrs. Henderson finally reached the scene, breathless and mortified. She could see that Wellington had somehow gotten himself tangled up with one of the guards, and the growing crowd of amused tourists was making her feel deeply embarrassed about her pet's behavior. "Wellington, come here at once," she called, but her voice was lost in the general commotion of excited voices and clicking cameras. The situation became more complicated when Wellington, startled by all the attention and noise around him, decided that the best strategy was to retreat to safety while keeping hold of his prize. Still gripping the cord firmly in his teeth, he began trying to back away from Guardsman Morrison, creating an increasingly awkward tug-of-war that was impossible for the soldier to ignore. Morrison was now facing a genuine crisis of protocol. He could not abandon his post or break his ceremonial stance without direct orders from a superior officer, but the situation was rapidly becoming untenable. The dog was pulling with surprising strength for such a small animal, and the crowd was growing larger and more animated by the moment. It was at this critical juncture that Marcus made his fatal error in judgment. Seeing that Wellington seemed to be losing interest in the tug-of-war, and fearing that his perfect video opportunity might be slipping away, he decided to take more direct action. He approached Wellington and began making encouraging noises, trying to rile up the dog's enthusiasm for the game. Detective Sergeant Williams arrived just in time to witness Marcus actively encouraging the dog to continue disrupting the guard. From her perspective, she saw an American tourist deliberately interfering with ceremonial duties while filming the disruption for his own entertainment. This transformed the situation from an innocent animal incident to potential harassment of military personnel on duty. "Sir, step away from the area immediately," Williams commanded in the authoritative tone she had perfected over years of dealing with unruly tourists. But Marcus, still focused on his phone screen and the unfolding drama, either didn't hear her or chose to ignore the instruction. Wellington, meanwhile, had become thoroughly confused by all the competing demands on his attention. Mrs. Henderson was calling him from one direction, Marcus was encouraging him from another, and the growing crowd was creating a cacophony of voices that made it impossible for the little dog to focus on any single command. His response was to grip the cord even more tightly and plant his feet more firmly. The comedy of errors reached its peak when Morrison, following his training to maintain his position at all costs, remained perfectly still while Wellington's increasingly frantic tugging began to affect his balance. The weight distribution of his ceremonial uniform, designed for standing at attention rather than resisting determined terriers, was not ideal for this particular challenge. Marcus, completely oblivious to the approaching police officer and the increasingly serious nature of the situation, began laughing loudly at what he saw as the absurdity of a highly trained soldier being outmaneuvered by a dog the size of a house cat. His laughter was infectious, and several other tourists began chuckling as well, creating exactly the kind of undignified spectacle that palace security was designed to prevent. Sarah finally realized that the situation had moved far beyond her husband's harmless prank into something potentially serious. She could see the uniformed police officer approaching with obvious intent, and she recognized the expression on Detective Sergeant Williams's face as one that suggested Marcus was about to face consequences he hadn't anticipated. But Marcus remained focused on his phone, capturing what he believed would be the climax of his viral video. He was so absorbed in documenting Wellington's continued assault on military protocol that he failed to notice the shift in atmosphere around him, the way other tourists were beginning to step back, the arrival of additional security personnel, and most critically, the fact that he was about to become the subject of official police attention. Wellington, for his part, was simply enjoying the best game of tug-of-war of his entire life, completely unaware that his playful behavior was about to create an international incident that would be discussed in police stations, military barracks, and tourist forums for years to come. The stage was set for Marcus's grand plan to go spectacularly wrong in ways that would exceed even his wildest expectations, though not in the direction he had hoped. The moment Marcus finally looked up from his phone screen and saw Detective Sergeant Williams standing directly behind him, his confident grin froze on his face. The police officer's expression made it immediately clear that she was not amused by the spectacle he had helped create, and the official nature of her approach suggested that his tourist immunity was about to expire. "Sir, I need you to step away from the guards and stop encouraging that animal immediately," Williams said in a tone that brooked no argument. Her hand rested casually on her radio, a subtle but unmistakable signal that she was prepared to call for backup if necessary. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that what he had seen as harmless entertainment was being treated as something much more serious. He glanced around and noticed for the first time that several other security personnel had positioned themselves strategically around the area, and the crowd of tourists was now watching him with expressions that ranged from amusement to concern. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus began using his most diplomatic voice. "I was just trying to help return this lost dog to its owner." He gestured toward Mrs. Henderson, who was still trying unsuccessfully to coax Wellington away from Guardsman Morrison's uniform. Williams was not impressed by his explanation. Her years of experience had taught her to recognize the difference between someone genuinely trying to help and someone who had been actively making a situation worse for their own entertainment. The video evidence on Marcus's still recording phone would clearly show which category he fell into. Wellington, meanwhile, had reached a state of pure canine bliss. The combination of his favorite game, a large audience, and what seemed like unlimited resistance from his opponent had triggered every play instinct he possessed. He was now growling playfully while shaking his head vigorously, treating the decorative cord like prey that needed to be thoroughly defeated. Guardsman Morrison was discovering muscles he didn't know he had as he fought to maintain his position while a determined terrier attempted to drag him across the plaza. The cord was securely attached to his uniform, so there was no possibility of Wellington simply running off with his prize. Instead, the situation had devolved into an endurance contest between military training and canine stubbornness. The absurdity of the scene was not lost on the growing crowd of onlookers. Here was one of the world's most disciplined soldiers, trained to stand motionless through everything from thunderstorms to protests, being gradually pulled off balance by an animal that weighed less than his ceremonial hat. Phones were recording from every angle, ensuring that this moment would be preserved for posterity. Detective Sergeant Williams made a decision that would escalate the situation beyond anything Marcus could have imagined. She stepped forward and firmly took hold of his arm. "Sir, I'm placing you under arrest for disturbing the peace and interfering with military personnel in the performance of their duties." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Arrest? He had come to London for a vacation, not to collect criminal charges. His real estate license, his business reputation, his standing in the Denver community, all of it could be jeopardized by an arrest record, even for something that seemed so minor. Wait, wait. Marcus protested, his voice rising in panic. This is crazy. I didn't do anything wrong. It's just a dog playing with a rope. But his protests only served to draw more attention to the scene, and Williams was already reaching for her handcuffs. Sarah finally found her voice and rushed to her husband's side. Officer, please, he's not a bad person. He just didn't understand the protocols here. We're tourists, we don't know the rules. Her plea was heartfelt, but Williams had already committed to her course of action. The situation took an even more surreal turn when Mrs. Henderson, finally reaching Wellington's position, decided that the only way to end the standoff was to sacrifice the rope entirely. She pulled a pair of small scissors from her handbag, the same scissors she used for deadheading flowers in her garden, and approached the tug-of-war with determination. Wellington, you naughty boy, release that at once, she commanded. But when the dog refused to comply, she made a decision that would become part of palace folklore. She cut the decorative cord, freeing Wellington from his prize, but also effectively vandalizing a piece of ceremonial, military uniform that was part of a tradition dating back centuries. The crowd gasped as Mrs. Henderson's scissors snipped through the cord. Wellington immediately fell backward, still clutching his hard-won trophy, while Guardsman Morrison suddenly found himself free from the bizarre contest that had tested every aspect of his professional training. But Mrs. Henderson's practical solution created a new problem. Damaging military property, even with the best of intentions, was a serious offense. Detective Sergeant Williams now found herself dealing with not one, but two potential violations of law, and the situation was spiraling further out of control with each passing moment. Marcus watched in horror as the elderly British woman was also approached by security personnel. His simple plan to make a guard break character had somehow resulted in multiple people facing potential legal consequences, and the video he had been so excited to share was now evidence in what appeared to be an international incident. The comedy reached its peak when Wellington, finally free to examine his prize properly, discovered that the decorative cord was not the simple rope toy he had imagined. The elaborate braiding, the metallic threads, and the unfamiliar texture made it far less appealing than he had anticipated. After a few experimental chews, he dropped it dismissively and trotted over to Sarah, apparently deciding that she looked like someone who might have actual treats. Guardsman Morrison, meanwhile, was finally able to reassess his situation. The immediate threat to his uniform was over, but he was now standing at attention with a clearly visible gap where an important piece of his ceremonial dress had been. His training covered many contingencies. But what to do when your uniform is partially destroyed by a well-meaning elderly woman with gardening scissors was not among them. The irony was not lost on the gathered crowd. Marcus had wanted to make the guard break character, and he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But instead of the simple reaction he had hoped for, he had created a chain of events that had resulted in property damage, potential arrests, and a diplomatic incident that would require explanation at the highest levels of both tourism and security management. As Detective Sergeant Williams began reading Marcus his rights, he realized that his moment of triumph had become the most expensive vacation photo of his life, and the story he would be telling back in Denver would be very different from the one he had originally planned. The walk to the police station was the longest 15 minutes of Marcus's life. Detective Sergeant Williams had been professional but firm as she escorted him away from the palace, while Sarah followed behind, alternating between furious whispers and mortified silence. Mrs. Henderson, who had been given a stern warning, but released due to her age and obvious good intentions, had disappeared into the crowd with Wellington, leaving behind only the severed decorative cord as evidence of the morning's chaos. At the Westminster police station, Marcus found himself in a small, windowless room that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in as he sat across from Detective Inspector Robert Clark, a patient man who had processed more tourist-related incidents than he cared to count, though few quite as bizarre as this one. "Mr. Thompson," Clark began, consulting his notes, "help me understand exactly what you thought you were accomplishing this morning." His tone was not unkind, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of the situation. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his plastic chair. The confidence that had carried him through decades of real estate negotiations seemed to have abandoned him entirely. "I honestly didn't think it would be a big deal," he said weakly. People try to make the guards react all the time. I've seen dozens of videos online. Yes, but most people don't actively orchestrate animal interference with ceremonial duties, Clark replied. And most people certainly don't continue filming and encouraging the disruption when it's clearly getting out of hand. The detective played back portions of Marcus's own video, which had been confiscated as evidence. Watching himself on the small screen, Marcus cringed at his obvious enthusiasm for the chaos he had helped create. His loud laughter and encouraging shouts to Wellington painted a picture of someone who was clearly enjoying the guards' discomfort rather than trying to resolve the situation. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Guardsman Morrison was experiencing his own form of bureaucratic nightmare. He had been relieved of duty and was now sitting in the duty officer's room, trying to explain how he had lost part of his ceremonial uniform to a small dog and an elderly woman with gardening scissors. Captain James Whitfield, Morrison's commanding officer, was struggling to maintain his military bearing while processing the most unusual incident report of his career. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Morrison," he said, referring to his notes. "You maintained your post and bearing throughout the entire incident, even while being physically pulled by a dog?" "Yes, sir," Morrison replied. "I followed protocol as trained, sir. And at no point did you break character or abandon your duties?" "No, sir. I remained at my post until the situation was resolved by civilian intervention." Captain Whitfield found himself in the unusual position of being simultaneously proud of his soldiers' discipline and exasperated by the absurd circumstances that had tested it. Morrison had technically performed his duties flawlessly, but the resulting spectacle had created exactly the kind of undignified scene that ceremonial protocols were designed to prevent. Back at the police station, Sarah was discovering that being married to someone who had just been arrested was almost as complicated as being arrested herself. She had been allowed to wait in the station's reception area, where she found herself surrounded by a fascinating cross-section of London's morning law enforcement needs. Pickpockets, drunk tourists, and one man who claimed to be the rightful heir to the throne of England. The duty sergeant, a kind woman named Collins who had seen every type of tourist crisis imaginable, brought Sarah a cup of tea and offered some unofficial advice. "First time in London, love?" she asked gently. "Yes," Sarah replied miserably, "and probably the last. My husband has this way of turning simple situations into disasters." Sergeant Collins nodded sympathetically. "We get a lot of Americans who don't quite understand how seriously we take our traditions here. Most of them just get a warning and a stern talking to. Your husband's situation is a bit more complicated because of the filming and the encouragement, but Inspector Clark is fair. He'll work something out." The situation became even more complex when the media got hold of the story. Someone in the crowd had uploaded their own video of the incident to social media, and it was spreading rapidly across platforms with hashtags like Dog V's Guard and Tourist Fail. The palace press office was fielding calls from news outlets around the world, all wanting to know more about the American tourist who had used a dog to attack British military tradition. Marcus, still sitting in the interview room, was completely unaware that his moment of poor judgment was becoming an international news story. He was focused entirely on Detective Inspector Clark's questions and the growing realization that this incident could have serious consequences for his life back in Denver. "The thing is, Mr. Thompson," Clark explained, "we have to take any interference with royal security very seriously. It doesn't matter whether you intended it as a harmless prank or not. The protocols exist for good reasons. And when tourists ignore them, it creates precedents that can lead to more serious problems. But surely you can see that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone or cause any real trouble," Marcus pleaded. "It was just supposed to be funny." Clark leaned back in his chair. "The problem is that your idea of funny required putting a member of Her Majesty's Guards in an impossible position. That young man was trained to stand his ground no matter what happened, and you deliberately created a situation designed to test that training for your own entertainment." The detective pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table between them. "Do you have any idea how many similar incidents we deal with every year? Tourists who think the rules don't apply to them, who treat our traditions as theme park entertainment." Marcus stared at the folder, realizing that it probably contained hundreds of cases similar to his own, each representing someone who had thought they were being clever or funny, and had discovered too late that their actions had consequences. The interview continued for another hour, covering every detail of the morning's events. Clark was thorough and professional, but Marcus could sense the detective's growing frustration with what he clearly saw as thoughtless tourist behavior. Every question made it clearer that Marcus had stumbled into something much more serious than he had ever imagined possible. By the time the interview concluded, Marcus understood that his London vacation was about to become a very expensive lesson in cultural sensitivity and the importance of understanding local laws before testing their boundaries. 3 hours after his arrest, Marcus found himself back in the reception area of Westminster Police Station, but not in the way he had hoped. Detective Inspector Clark had delivered news that was both better and worse than he had expected. The charges against him were being reduced to a simple fine and formal caution, but the conditions attached to this leniency would ensure that his London vacation would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. "Mr. Thompson," Clark had explained, "you're very fortunate that Guardsman Morrison has declined to press formal charges, and that Mrs. Henderson's quick thinking prevented any permanent damage to military property. However, the Metropolitan Police and the Palace Security Team have agreed on conditions for your release." The conditions were humiliating in ways Marcus had never imagined possible. He was banned from all royal properties for the remainder of his stay in London, required to pay for the replacement of the damaged ceremonial cord, and, most embarrassingly, obligated to write formal letters of apology to Guardsman Morrison, Mrs. Henderson, and the commanding officer of the Queen's Guard. But the real punishment was still to come. As Marcus and Sarah emerged from the police station into the gray London afternoon, they discovered that their morning's adventure had taken on a life of its own. Marcus's phone, which had been returned with his other belongings, immediately began buzzing with notifications from social media platforms, news outlets, and friends back home who had seen the videos circulating online. The footage of Wellington's assault on military protocol had been viewed millions of times across various platforms. News organizations had picked up the story with headlines ranging from the mildly amused American tourist dog prank goes wrong to the more severe tourist arrested after disrupting royal guard ceremony. Marcus found himself portrayed as everything from a harmless prankster to an example of ugly American tourism at its worst. Sarah read the comments on one of the viral videos over Marcus's shoulder, her face growing pale as she realized the scope of their newfound notoriety. "Listen to this one," she said quietly. "Typical American tourist with no respect for other cultures. And this one, hope they banned him from the country permanently." The walk back to their hotel was a gauntlet of recognition and whispered comments. Other tourists who had witnessed the morning's events pointed them out to their companions, and Marcus found himself wondering if everyone they passed had seen the videos. The anonymity that usually came with travel had been completely stripped away, replaced by an uncomfortable celebrity that followed them through the London streets. At their hotel, the situation became even more surreal. The desk clerk, who had been perfectly professional during their check-in 3 days earlier, now regarded Marcus with barely concealed amusement. "Mr. Thompson," he said with exaggerated politeness, "I trust you've had an eventful day sightseeing?" The evening news coverage was the final blow to Marcus's dignity. BBC London ran a segment about tourist behavior at royal sites, using his incident as a prime example of what not to do. The report included expert commentary from a royal historian who explained the significance of the ceremonial uniforms and the centuries of tradition that tourists like Marcus failed to appreciate. Even worse was the interview with Mrs. Henderson, who had been tracked down by enterprising reporters. The elderly woman handled the media attention with typical British grace, describing Marcus as well-meaning but terribly misguided, and expressing hope that he would learn something valuable from this unfortunate experience. Guardsman Morrison, bound by military protocol, could not be interviewed directly, but his commanding officer provided a statement, emphasizing the professionalism displayed by the guard throughout the incident, and noting that such disruptions, while rare, required serious consequences to prevent copycat behavior. Back in their hotel room, Marcus and Sarah sat in stunned silence as they processed the day's events. The vacation they had planned as a romantic getaway had become an international incident, and Marcus's attempt to create a memorable moment had succeeded beyond his wildest nightmares. "I can't believe this is happening," Marcus said, scrolling through endless social media posts featuring his face. It was supposed to be funny. It was just a dog playing with a rope. Sarah looked at her husband with a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. "Marcus, you filmed yourself encouraging a dog to harass a soldier who couldn't defend himself. How did you think that was going to end?" The phone calls from home began that evening. Marcus's business partner wanted to know if the viral videos would affect their real estate firm's reputation. His mother called in tears, having seen her son's arrest reported on the evening news in Denver. Friends and colleagues reached out with a mixture of concern, amusement, and barely concealed schadenfreude. Perhaps the most painful call came from Marcus's teenage nephew, who had always looked up to his successful uncle. "Uncle Marcus," the boy said, "my friends at school are all sharing videos of you getting arrested. They think it's hilarious, but I'm kind of embarrassed." The financial consequences were immediate and substantial. The replacement cost for the ceremonial cord was far higher than Marcus had anticipated, reflecting both the specialized craftsmanship required and the historical significance of the piece. The legal fees, though modest by American standards, added to the growing expense of what was supposed to be a relaxing vacation. But the social consequences were proving to be far more lasting. The internet's capacity for preserving embarrassing moments meant that Marcus's 15 minutes of infamy would follow him indefinitely. Every future Google search of his name would bring up the incident, affecting everything from business relationships to social interactions. 3 days later, as Marcus and Sarah prepared to cut their vacation short and return to Denver, they received an unexpected visitor at their hotel. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the lobby with Wellington on his leash, looking every bit the proper British lady despite her role in the international incident. "Mr. Thompson," she said with characteristic directness, "I wanted to speak with you before you left London." Marcus braced himself for another lecture about respect for British traditions, but Mrs. Henderson surprised him. "Wellington and I bear some responsibility for what happened. He's always been rather headstrong, and I should have kept better control of him. I wanted you to know that I don't hold any grudges, and I hope you won't let this experience sour you on Britain entirely." Her grace in the face of their shared embarrassment only made Marcus feel worse about his role in the incident. Here was an elderly woman who had been dragged into an international news story through no fault of her own, and she was offering him forgiveness and perspective. As their plane lifted off from Heathrow Airport, Marcus stared down at the city that had taught him such an expensive lesson about the difference between confidence and wisdom. The story he would tell for the rest of his life had been written, but it was very different from the triumph he had originally envisioned. Wellington, meanwhile, had already moved on to new adventures, though Mrs. Henderson had invested in a stronger leash and kept a much closer eye on her mischievous companion during their walks past the palace. The little dog had no idea that he had briefly been the most famous terrier in the world, having achieved something that centuries of human tourists had failed to accomplish. He had successfully disrupted the legendary composure of a Queen's Guard, even if the victory had come at a higher cost than anyone involved had anticipated.